This is something I challenged Sir Keir directly over, you may recall, in the last call, Keir, when I asked him if a very conservative, small c, conservative estimate of the number of children, parents who couldn't afford it. And I asked him, how many children are in private education? He didn't have an idea, didn't have a clue, nor did the Shadow Chancellor. If you're putting it's all numbers, isn't it? If you're putting a policy, and by the way, the number is broadly 600,000. So let's be really small c conservative and say 10% of parents say, we can't find the VAT, we just can't. That's 60,000 children you're suddenly going to want to feed into the state sector. Have we got those spare desks? No, of course we hasn't. And I speak as someone, I never hide this. I was fortunate enough to attend a private school. My parents worked damn hard for that. And I was fortunate enough to send my 2 children to private school as well. Labour do not understand private schools. They think everybody has their child at Eton, Harrow or Winchester, and they don't. There are people, as I say every time, they don't change their cars. They don't go on holiday. They don't put an extension in the loft. Instead, they channel the money, which, by the way, we're free to do because they want to spend it on education. Labour don't get it.
We turn our attention next to one of my all-time favourite subjects, and it is a subject upon which I have very strong views, which are incredibly, well, in a sense, they are quite hypocritical. Have you worked out what it is yet? Can you tell what it is yet? I noticed that the Secretary of State for Education has taken a day off from threatening to punch Ofsted inspectors or complain about the fact that people don't congratulate her enough for doing a brilliant job. Those are Gillian Keegan's greatest hits, I believe, aren't they? Saying that she would punch Ofsted inspectors if they were rude to her and complaining that people don't praise her enough for doing a brilliant job. She's taken a day off from her hobbies and has instead accused Labour of not understanding private schools. Indeed, it was an interview, I believe, with our very own, Natasha Clark, in which she said it's a really ill-thought-through policy. They don't really understand. They think of larger schools like Eton and places like that. The policy to which she objects is Sir Keir Starmer's intention to remove a VAT exemption for private schools. Because at the moment, if you are buying your dinner, you have to pay VAT. But if you are paying to send your child to a private school, you don't have to pay VAT on that bill. I want to do this in a slightly different way from how we've done it in the past, but I need to get my usual gubbins out of the way first. It is objectively hilarious that people who are in the business of denying poverty, if you're talking about the necessity of food banks, for example, or you're talking about people who run out of money before they run out of month and actually can't afford things like toothbrushes or toothpaste. Hygiene poverty is a real thing. The Observer reported on Sunday of children whose teachers at schools are having to wash their clothes or stick them in the shower twice a week. Families in this country at this point in history who have got nothing, who reach the end of the rope long before they reach the end of the month. And people who deny that problem exists, people who malign individuals who find themselves in that sort of trouble, people who insist that poverty is somehow a lifestyle choice, people who make great capital in newspaper columns and the House of Commons, claiming that anybody who is vulnerable, anybody who is in need, anybody who is poverty-stricken is there through their own fault. And all they have to do is get a better job, or perhaps use the value range in their local supermarket. They can even perhaps cook a meal for 30p if they simply get the right lesson. So all of those people who are, I think, dismissive to the point of cruelty when it comes to poverty and financial vulnerability, when it comes to VAT on school fees, they suddenly become crusaders. They become charity. Won't somebody think of the private school parents? The idea that not being able to afford to feed your family makes you a liar, but not being able to afford to pay VAT on your school fees makes you a victim is the most perfect example of how bent much of our commentariat is. Poor people over there, screw them. Wealthy people over there, going to find a few more quid if they want to keep their child in private school. Won't somebody think of that? Won't somebody speak for them? Pass me my violin. I've got a sonata brewing. And it is extraordinary. For the record, my parents were very much in that category of people who scrimped and saved to send me to expensive schools. But the fact that they could scrimp and save enough to send me to an expensive school puts them in a privileged position, even if they didn't feel it particularly, even if among our peer group we were far from the wealthiest family, even if at school, when it came to how much money was left over at the end of the month in my family, there wouldn't have been much because they'd spent so much on school fees, and I was at school with people who had moats around their house. So that I understand the hierarchy. And I would also add to the conversation, my dad worked very hard, because he did. But so do coal miners, and they can't dream of sending their children to a school like mine. I mean, we don't really have many coal miners. Did you know that Christopher Dean's dad was a coal miner out of Torville and Dean? I didn't know that. I interviewed him yesterday for full disclosure. I interviewed both of them. So it's a groundbreaking full disclosure, because it's the first time I've ever interviewed two people at the same time. So people think I don't work hard. That means I work twice as hard on this week's full disclosure as I usually do, because I had two people in the room for an hour as opposed to just one. So the question now, the political question about private schools is about fairness, okay? I don't want to have a conversation about how hard you work and how unfair it is. I feel for you. And when I say to you, if you really, really think you're not going to be able to afford school fees after the VAT exemption is abolished, then you need to get a better job or cancel your Netflix subscription or eat fewer avocados. I'm joking, and I have my tongue in my cheek. Because it's the unfairness of this practice that intrigues me the most. Those of us that pay to send our children to private school do so because it's unfair. We are buying an unfair advantage for our children. I don't quite understand the psychological necessity of denying that. For people to pretend that they're not aware that that is what they're doing, for people to deny that that is what we're doing. That is why we are doing it. My late father's motivation was particularly poetic, because he ended up in a profession where people who went to public school in particular enjoyed obvious advantages over people who didn't. The notion of the old school tie was very, very prevalent in Fleet Street in general, but the Daily Telegraph in particular, where he spent most of his career. And so when he had the opportunity to send me to the sort of school that some of his colleagues had gone to, he took it. He knew exactly what he was doing. I used to even describe it as a golden ticket. He was buying me a golden ticket, like Charlie Buckets, except it was worth more than just chocolate. And some of us do the same. And we do it because we know it's unfair. So I think the only morally honest position with regard to private education is that if you can afford it, you should do it, but you should also be in favour of its abolition at the same time. So there's no earthly way I'm going to let Muggins over there buy an advantage for his children that I am denying to mine. I want my children to have every advantage money can buy. For me, that's part and parcel of being a parent. But there are some advantages that shouldn't be for sale, and that would include education. So what I like about Starmer's policy is that it ideally will shrink the pool of people who are getting that unfair advantage. So if you're not going to get rid of it altogether, then the best thing you can do is have fewer people availing themselves of the unfair advantage. Here is an unfair advantage. It becomes more unfair according to how many people have it. It ceases to be an unfair advantage when everybody has it. If everybody has equal access to something, it's not an advantage and it's not unfair. I don't think you can achieve that. I don't think you're ever going to be able to do that. And even if you abolish private education, some people would be paying for their children to have private tuition in the evenings or at weekends, so they would be buying an unfair advantage. But what I want you to try to... Actually, Charlie's ticket got him the whole factory, didn't it? I apologise. It wasn't just chocolate. I thank you to Karen and Jane and others for pointing that out. I want to examine the unfairness of it, if I can. That's all. I want to do this as if we were foreign, because it's such a baked-in part of British society. If you were listening yesterday, we had a fascinating phone-in about the psychological damage that these schools can do to people, but partly as a consequence of Princess Diana, the late Diana, Princess of Wales's brother Charles, talking about his experiences, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and it was a very powerful, very, very poignant phone-in. So I'm not under any illusions about the negatives as opposed to the positives, but the reason why these institutions exist is to entrench inequality and to entrench unfairness. It's all very well for me to sit here and talk about having gone to one and wanting to buy it for my children because we don't come from wealth. You know, my dad didn't even go to university, left school at 15, grew up above a pub in Leeds. So I can give you that slightly hackneyed backstory as a justification for trying to keep up with the toffs or catch up with the toffs. But it's still unfair because you leave 90-odd% of the country behind you. So what I really want to do, if you can help with this, what I really want to do is describe what the unfairness looks like from the outside. Okay? From the outside, because I don't know. I'm going to tell you something I've never told you before. It doesn't keep me awake at night, but I do wonder about it a lot. If you hadn't had the education I had, and I mean the class side of it more necessarily than the exam result side of it. If I hadn't had my entry into that world, if Mum and Dad hadn't bought me that golden ticket, where would I be now? I don't know. I love my job. I mean, I really, really love my job. You can probably tell most days. And, you know, I'm incredibly blessed in so many ways. And I'd love to think that it was down to talent, right? I'd love to think that even if I'd gone to what the Tories used to call a bog standard comprehensive school, somehow my great talent would have emerged and flooded. I'd love to believe that. But the thing I've never really told you before is that I don't. I wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have had the I don't even want to say confidence, because it wasn't confidence. It was an ability to hide anxiety. It was an ability to hide the fact that you were nervous or you had imposter syndrome or you felt inadequate. The swagger is learned behavior. I walk into a room, people think I'm arrogant. On the inside, I'm weeping with nerves and anxiety. But on the outside, I look like the real deal. Not now. I'm a different person now, but in my 20s, it's when I got onto newspapers. I'd be physically sick at the thought of having to walk around a room and speak to all the famous people in it in the hope of getting a story. I'm not exaggerating. Physically sick in the bathroom, in the toilet. Physically sick. I used to carry a toothbrush with me in my briefcase, and then I'd scrub myself up, go back out, gird my loins, and do it. And that was swagger that I'd learnt at school. It's not healthy necessarily, but that belief that your talent is... I mean, have a look around now. Let's just pick a few people, right? Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Rishi Sunak. If you went to a normal comprehensive school, if those kids had been at your school, would they have ended up Prime Minister? Secretary of State for Business? Would they? No. So how come they did? How come they ended up Prime Minister? How come David Cameron ended up Prime Minister? How come 20 people from the same school have ended up Prime Minister? It cannot be the case that the school somehow attracts epic talent, that the school creates gifts that lend themselves to public life or politics or wealth. It doesn't. The level of unfairness here is absolutely extraordinary. But because it is baked into our society and has been for a couple of 100 years, we very rarely take time to properly point it out. And do you know what part of the problem here is? Me. Because how many people who conduct these conversations, whether in television studios or on the radio or anywhere else, in how many people who conduct these conversations have had the education, have had the private education? Massive majority of us, hugely overrepresented in all major professions. High court judges, I think, are among the worst. But massively over. So almost always, the conversation about private education is going to be conducted by a disproportionate number of privately educated people. You know? So even now, this conversation is biased. Even now, somewhere inside, I'm justifying what might appear to you to be hypocrisy. Even now, there's a little bit of me that thinks, yeah, you'd still be Billy Big Bananas on LBC if you'd not gone to public school. You'd still, yeah, of course you would. But I wouldn't. Deep down, you wouldn't. So what I want to know is what it looks like from the outside. The injustice and the unfairness of private education. Explain it to somebody from, I don't know, Peru. That's what I want to hear, what it looks like from the outside. I don't want to have the old conversation about how hard you work and how your children deserve it and, you're not rich at all and you go without holidays. I know all that. That's where I come from. That's my background. I want to know what it looks like from the outside. I want to have a conversation about private education without speaking to any privately educated people, because we've never done that before. And why have we never done that before? Because I'm biased. Because I conduct the conversation in the context of my own existence. I don't want to. I want to conduct it in yours or Keir Starmer's. How does it look from the outside? 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. I'm in favour of the policy because it reduces the number of people getting the unfair advantage, but I'm one of them. I can afford it. So this is, hypocrisy 2.0 in some ways, but it's actually a morally defensible position. The only morally defensible position for private education is that you will pay whatever you can to improve your children's life chances, while also being in favour of the removal of unfair advantages, even if you are able to afford them yourself. I mean, it must drive you potty if you can't afford it or you're worried about being able to pay your VAT to hear me explain it so clearly. But this conversation isn't about you or about me. This conversation is about you. What does private education look like to people who haven't had it and can't afford it? I.e., 90-odd% of people listening to this programme now. So every other conversation about private education we've ever had has excluded 90-odd% of the audience. Every conversation you ever hear on any radio station about private education is conducted almost exclusively by the parents of privately educated children or the beneficiaries of a private education, which means you never hear, I never hear, the conversation about how unfair it is.